Hello, my name is Paulina Personius, and I work for the organization Earthworks as our international campaigner on what is called our Making Clean Energy Clean campaign, which focuses on mining and the energy transition.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Kilowatt, a podcast about electric vehicles, renewable energy, autonomous driving, and much, much more. My name is Bodhi, and I am your host. And on today's episode, we sat down with Paulina Personius, and we chatted about a report that an organization called Earthworks put out called Minimizing Mining Impacts on the Road to Zero Emissions Transport. And if you think you know what that means, you probably don't, because I genuinely thought that this was all going to be, this conversation was going to be all about sustainable mining. And it's not that at all. Now, I'm not going to spoil it and give it away because Paulina and I are going to discuss some of the things that are in this report. But I will tell you, I was pleasantly surprised. I learned a lot. I actually woke up this morning at 6 o'clock, started reading this around 6:30 and finished around 11. I did some other things in there, here and there. But this report is jam-packed full of information. And after you listen to this interview, if you want to find out more, I'm going to put a link to the report in the show notes. It's about 52 pages long. And again, full of really interesting information. Like, this report might spawn future special episodes because I was kind of blown away by some of the things that they talk about in the report. But again, I don't want to spoil it. Before we get to the interview, I do want to ask a favor. I've told you before about my new podcast, Beyond the Post, where we talk about all things digital creation, from social media to YouTube to podcasting. And we're even going to have some authors and different types of writers on in the coming seasons. Every year, the Daily Tech News Show goes on a week-long hiatus. They give everybody in the company a week off, and they allow other podcasts or other shows to take over their feed. They have graciously allowed Rob and I to take over the Daily Tech News Show feed on Thursday, August 22nd. And Rob and I prepared a special episode for that DTNS feed takeover. And I would really appreciate it if you went and listened. I'll put a link to Daily Tech News Show in the show notes if you don't already subscribe to that podcast. But I'd really appreciate it if you listened to the episode and then you gave Tom and the team over at Daily Tech News Show your honest feedback. It doesn't have to be good feedback. You can give us negative feedback. That's okay. But it would really mean a lot to me if you listened to that particular episode and you gave Daily Tech News Show some feedback on it. And their email address is feedback@dailytechnewsshow.com. So listen to the episode, tell them what you think. It would really mean a lot to me if you did that. All right, enough of my shameless self-promotion. Let's welcome Paulina to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Okay, so Earthworks did this very holistic report on reducing the need for mining. Do you want to just kind of give us a brief overview of what that report was and what the kind of goals for the report were?
Yeah, I would love to. So this report is actually a report that we at Earthworks commissioned from the University of Technology, Sydney, from their Institute for Sustainable Futures, which we had worked with previously on 2 reports in the past that focused mainly on battery minerals recycling. And we commissioned this 3rd report because we felt like the conversation around the clean energy transition, around EVs, around the transition away from fossil fuels was sort of based around 2 options. It was either we stick to fossil fuels or we mine more in order to transition to electric vehicles or EVs. And we felt like there were quite a few third options or other options that were being ignored that would allow us to both transition away from fossil fuels and also a transition away from a dependence on mining, which is also a very harmful extractive industry. And so this report was a bit of our way to insert those other options into the debate and into conversations and show that there are ways that we can transition from fossil fuels while also decreasing our dependence on mining.
Okay, I think that's great. When I read through this, I admitted this earlier, I honestly thought, just based on the title, I was like, oh, this is going to be about, you know, more sustainable mining, and that could not be further from the truth. There are a lot of options in the report that, or they call them principles, that could help us reduce the need for instance cars. So there's 5 principles. Let's jump into the first one, which is reducing car dependence. What are some of the ways the report outlined we could reduce car dependence?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I would say the report focuses quite a bit on reducing car dependence, in part because it's one of the biggest ways that we could have a significant impact on mining demand. And so it's an important way to reduce mining demand. And a lot of the cases that are kind of highlighted under that principle, like you said, there are 5 principles in the report, and that's the first one, focus on redesigning cities to encourage a shift from personal or private vehicle use to public transportation, walking and cycling. So putting the infrastructure in so that people choose those options and so that those are viable options, right? I think often, especially maybe from a more US-centric perspective, a lot of our cities don't really have adequate infrastructure to encourage people to use public transit, to make it a convenient option, or to encourage people to walk or bikes and still feel safe doing so. And so there are infrastructure choices that cities can begin to implement so that those are more feasible options for people.
Yeah, the thing that I got the most excited about, and maybe I shouldn't have started with this because this was honestly, it lit me on fire this morning. 15-minute cities, because when I was reading through it, and I was like, well, how do you design a city to, you know, cities can be massive, they can be small, they can be massive. I live in Tempe, which is a part of the, you know, a small part of the greater Phoenix area, and we are a massive metropolis. From one end of the valley to the other, it could take you 45 minutes to an hour. And that's even if you're going from populated place to populated place. If you want to go a little bit more rural to rural, it could take more than an hour. So there's a lot of people and a lot of cities in between that. How do you take that and make it into something that will make people want to reduce their dependence on their vehicle? In 15-minute cities was one of the solutions in the report. Do you want to talk a little bit about 15-minute cities?
Yeah, sure. So 15-minute cities is an urban design and kind of city planning concept that focuses on the idea that sort of all of your day-to-day typical needs or weekly needs are within a 15-minute walk, bicycle ride, or public transit ride from your home. So this would include things like grocery stores and sort of the typical things that you might need to run errands, banks, stuff like that, schools for families that have children, green spaces and parks so that people can get outdoors, having all of that within sort of a 15-minute radius around your home. And this is something that you've seen implemented in many cities in different regions around the world, sometimes under different names. You've seen it in places like Portland in the US, which has really been focused on trying to reduce car use by starting the idea they have a 20-minute neighborhood plan. So the idea that you could, you know, get to most of your daily needs by 2030 by walking or cycling, and that falls into a 20-minute time span. And then you also see it in places like Barcelona, which talks about super blocks where you have everything kind of densely concentrated. You've also seen it implemented in Buenos Aires and Argentina, as well as in Melbourne, Australia. Some of them use 15 minutes, some of them use 20 minutes, but yeah, it's the idea that kind of everything you need to be able to go through your daily life is pretty closely located to your home.
Yeah, and what I also found fascinating, because I don't know if you've ever been to Phoenix, but it is a sprawl for sure. One of the things I found fascinating is what they were doing in Bogota by giving a dedicated center lane. The bus stops in the middle of the road. There are pedestrian bridges that go across, so you're not worried about anybody getting hit. But those dedicated lanes are for the electric buses. There's another program in Auckland that they tried out where they were basically doing like ride hailing with minivans or some type of passenger van. In Phoenix in particular, I think would be a fantastic solution because we have a lot of neighborhoods that are not exactly convenient to bus stops. We also, it can take quite a while to travel by bus to somewhere where it wouldn't take you nearly as long if you were driving in your car or you were Ubering or whatever. So this would be a good, kind of like a hybrid blend of getting you to where you need to be, but also if you have to make those longer trips by bus, you can use the minivan ride hailing service, get to the bus stop, and then get to your destination in a relatively timely manner versus walking. We've had over 80 days of over 80 days of over 100-degree temperatures here in Arizona. It's not practical or even humane to make people walk the distance, even if it's outside your neighborhood. Like it would still be an 8 or 9 minute walk for me just to walk to the bus in my neighborhood. So that would not be a good solution for me to take to work because I'm going to be sweaty by the time I get to the bus stop. So I like these kind of thinking outside the box solutions.
Yeah, I agree. I also think that something that we talk about in this report quite a bit, and that we look at Earthworks is the fact that a lot of these solutions actually create much more accessible cities, and create an energy transition and an energy system where a lot more people are accessing the benefits, right? Um, Something like telling people to buy electric vehicles, that's something that only a pretty small percentage of the population is going to be able to afford. And so only a small percentage of the population might be benefiting from that type of proposed solution. But with something like public transit and active transit options, which include walking and biking, um, often it makes it more accessible. Like more people can economically access that. It can make the city a lot easier for people to navigate. And I think something like the Auckland transit model that you're talking about, the sort of ride hailing model that could get you short distances, makes public transit a lot more accessible, right? Like maybe you are unable to walk long distances, and so you can use it. Maybe you're a family that has small children that can't walk as far, and it makes it so that those people can also access public transit and benefit from that type of infrastructure.
Let's shift over to what the principle two, which is smaller EVs with smaller battery packs. So, what's the benefit to smaller EVs, and why should we want more small EVs?
Yeah, this is such a great question. I think the main thing with smaller EVs is that smaller EVs have a smaller battery, which means that they have a smaller mineral footprint, or they require fewer minerals to go into them. Or you could say if you have a certain mineral supply, you could create more batteries from that same mineral supply if they are smaller rather than larger. And so, we talk a lot about having, smaller vehicle size, smaller vehicle batteries. And we've found that globally, if we shifted towards smaller vehicles, or by we found the report talks about from previous research, that it could reduce the demand for battery minerals by up to 25% in 2050. So a pretty significant amount. Another report that was done by the C plus CP, the Climate and Community Project in the US, found that you could reduce lithium demand by, I think it was like up to, oh man, I'll have to find the exact number, but I think you could reduce it by 42% if you went down to like the smallest vehicle size in the US. That was just for the US. Um, and I think in general, there is a current trend towards larger vehicles, especially in a place like the US. Um, Over 80% of our EV market at the moment are SUVs. Um, whereas in a lot of other regions, like in Europe and a lot of parts of Eastern and Southeast Asia, you get a much smaller vehicle sizes. And we have these large vehicles in the US, but they don't actually match our driving distance. I think people often want a larger vehicle and a larger vehicle EV battery so that they can hold charge and drive for longer distances. But that's not really matching how we actually use our cars. And so, reducing our vehicle size would be a pretty simple way to, one, make electric vehicles a bit cheaper and more accessible for a wider range of people in the US, and two, reduce our mineral demand.
Yeah, Ford recently said in an earnings call, Jim Farley, Ford's CEO, said that they were going to start building smaller EVs and they were going to start being more intentional about the size of their battery packs because I did it. I overbought on my battery pack. But, when you're spending, 40, 50, 60, $70,000 on a vehicle, you don't want to buy something that you're like, oh, well, this battery pack's too small and I can't do what I want it to do. And Ford's research showed that most people are just overbuying on the battery pack. So there needs to be better education in that regard. But there also needs, I don't know how things are in Mexico as far as EV infrastructure. I would imagine Mexico City has probably got tons, but we also need a little bit better charging infrastructure here. No, there's not tons. No.
I mean, yeah, not tons. I think it's still a bit of a work in progress.
Yeah, it kind of seems like there's a lot that goes into putting in a charging station. So I would imagine that you know it's probably pretty similar countries around the world as far as the amount of red tape that you have to go through and deals that need to be made to make that happen. But yeah, we still need to have a little bit better charging infrastructure. I think we're getting there globally. I'm not just specifically talking about the US because this is an international show, but um, I'm on board with this for sure. The smaller cars, smaller battery packs. We just need to have better charging infrastructure. Was there anything else on smaller cars that would, other than it, makes it more affordable for everybody to own an EV? Was there anything else on that we missed?
I don't think so. Maybe I would just also add that because there are some countries where there's a bit of that resistance to smaller cars. But even if, according to the IEA, right, the International Energy Agency, like even if we kept our battery sizes the same as they are at the moment, the same as they are today, instead of continuing to increase our car and car battery sizes, we would still be able to avoid like a 16% increase in our battery metal and mineral demand by 2030. So yeah, I definitely think it's a pretty important solution to explore. I am happy to hear that Ford is interested in providing, smaller EV vehicles on the US market because I think that's important. I think yes, maybe consumers are overbuying, but also if you're looking at a global market where 60% of EVs are SUVs, it's also kind of pushing you in that direction, right? So hopefully they do start to do that. I would love to see that.
And I don't want to make Ford make it into some altruistic decision. It came down to money for sure. Like they can make way more profit on a smaller car with a smaller battery than they do on the bigger cars with the bigger batteries. And they even said that. So it's not like I'm talking out of school or anything like that. But yeah, I want to say that somewhere in the report, and it was either through car sharing or it was through using electric buses. It was like you could take I think it was through car sharing, like Uber or whatever, or just like everybody rents a car and it's parked in a common location. You could take like 9 vehicles off the road by having that option. But I should have wrote that down. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. Yeah, I know that I think under principle 3, we looked a bit at um car sharing as an option. I think there's still a little bit more research needed on exactly what the impact is, but there is the possibility of car sharing, particularly in a city. You know, if we begin to implement a lot of these solutions in tandem, if you have a city where people can reasonably or feasibly choose to opt for other transportation options outside of just owning their own car sharing can be a good way to supplement that when you do decide that there are moments where you need a car, right? Um, but I think there's still a little bit more research, and for some of those cases, I think they are still a bit too new to fully understand how that impacts car ownership. But I think there is potentially a chance for it to have an impact on that.
Yeah, and it seems like from reading the report, it seems like none of the things talked about are things that are going to happen tomorrow. You know, these are things we're looking at 10 years, 20 years, 30 years down the road, especially when it comes to manufacturing. We'll move on to that in a moment. But one of the things I thought was interesting under Principle 3 was remanufacturing and repurposing EV batteries. Everybody talks about, when an EV battery when it's time to be taken out of the vehicle, it can be repurposed for renewable energy storage and all that stuff. One of the things that I had not considered was most of the cells in that battery pack are still good, and that battery pack could be refurbished or remanufactured back to 100% by replacing some cells. What are what are some of the, and I don't want to be negative here because I think that there are probably some downsides here. So let's talk about the upsides, and then we'll talk about some of the downsides on that of remanufacturing the battery pack.
Yeah. So I think remanufacturing is still a bit of a new idea that's still sort of being developed. But I think in general, it kind of aligns with some of for example, a lot of the principles that you might see in the e-waste or electronic waste space in general, where they're looking at how can you repair instead of having to buy something new, right? So kind of extend the lifespan of an object. And so I think it kind of aligns with those principles and is looking into there's research looking into how that can be done in a way that is safe in order to sort of extend the life cycle or the lifespan of EV batteries.
Excellent. Okay, so that brings us to principle 4. We have battery recycling. We have advanced recycling techniques. What I was really kind of blown away by is I didn't realize that very little, if any, of the lithium ion gets recycled.
Yes.
That surprised me, actually, a lot.
Yeah, very, very little battery minerals get recycled currently. And I think also going back to what you were saying about refurbishment and repair and remanufacturing, all of those same things that make it kind of difficult to get into a battery cell and battery packs and that can make it dangerous also apply in recycling scenarios. Like recycling can also be very dangerous. And depending on the type of battery mineral recycling that you're doing, there can also be a lot of environmental concerns that come with that, and concerns for communities that live near battery recycling facilities. So I think, whenever we talk about battery minerals recycling, like we would definitely love to see more recycling. We would love to see more research and innovation and funding going towards battery mineral recycling and trying to figure out how to build a battery in a way so that it can be safely recycled. But we always want to add that caveat that, there are a lot of sort of safety and environmental pollution concerns that need to be considered alongside recycling. But I mean, there are quite a few studies that have emerged over the last few years that show that you can have pretty significant recovery rates if battery recycling is prioritized. And so again, that would be a way to decrease the need for new mining or for the expansion of mining.
Yeah. No, I always pronounce this wrong.
Metallurgy. Metallurgy.
Metallurgy. Thank you. And hydrometallurgy. I was actually surprised. I think it was like 80 or 90% you could get back of the battery materials through hydro. And it's you don't have quite as much in terms of the issues with the noxious fumes and things like that. You're still going to have, I would imagine you're going to have wastewater that needs to be treated somehow or stored somewhere. You can't get away from it. There's caustic chemicals in the battery packs, but it's more expensive, so it's not normally used as an option. And again, there's not a lot of EV batteries that are being recycled at the moment, so maybe it will become cheaper 10, 15 years from now when we're out, when we're aging out some of these vehicles.
Yeah, I think I would also add that, there's a lot about EV battery design that is still changing and evolving. There's a lot of research going into EV battery design. And so nothing I think is necessarily set in stone. But I think if we began to think about design with recycling in mind, we could make it so that batteries are easier and cheaper to recycle. Whereas I think a lot of batteries on the market now aren't necessarily being produced with that in mind or aren't being designed with that in mind. And that is why you get something like pyrometallurgy, where they're like, we don't know how to take this apart, and so we're just going to kind of burn it and try and see what we can recuperate from it. Like, that shows a process where recycling was an afterthought. And so then you get a form of recycling that can be really harmful, can be really toxic, like you mentioned, and doesn't even have as high of recovery rates. So yeah, I think that's why I say sort of it is something that, and sort of something that we talk about a lot at Earthworks and in this report, is that, it's so important to look at the whole EV supply chain, right? We focus a lot on mining, but we know that we can't just focus on that one point of extraction. There are all these other decisions being made along the supply chain that sort of influence at different points. And so decisions being made at the battery design stage are influencing the sort of end of life cycle stage, where potentially it's going to be recycled or maybe not, depending on how it was designed and how easy it is to take it apart and how easy it is to recover the materials in that battery. So yeah, it's kind of important to think about that full life cycle in a bit more of a holistic way. I think the report also talks about a really great example of a Mercedes-Benz factory that is still pretty new, but it has been looking into battery minerals recycling and has reported with hydrometallurgical recycling processes that it can recover up to 96% of some of the key metals and minerals in the battery, like lithium and nickel and cobalt. And I mean, that's a huge number.
Let's get to principle 5, which I think is probably more up your alley, which is sourcing minerals responsibly. We think about, the environmental harms that happen when we dig into the earth and we get these minerals out. But oftentimes we ignore the indigenous people that are kind of like, there's never a movie that's shot from the point of view of the mining company that's the good guy and the indigenous group or the group of people in a community that they're the bad guys. Like, that never happens, right? So there are protections in place, some of them enforceable, some of them not, about mining where indigenous people live. And then there's also labor laws, and it just kind of goes on and on and on. So I don't want to steal any of your thunder here, because I probably wouldn't make it sound very smart. So talk a little bit about, mining in indigenous communities and making sure that laborers are taken care of and feel comfortable, coming forward when, the bad things are being done.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this is a really important part of the report. While we really want to focus on reducing mineral demand, we also recognize that there are mines already up and running for many of these metals and minerals, and also that there will be some need for mining. And so we also want to think about how can we do this in a way where we're the most protective of fragile ecosystems and of communities. With regards to indigenous peoples, I think this is not a new issue. Indigenous peoples have historically been those most impacted by mining and by many harmful extractive industries. And unfortunately, we see that pattern continuing with the minerals that are being used for energy transition technologies. A study that was published in the journal Nature and Sustainability showed that 54% of transition mineral mines are on or near indigenous peoples' territory. So something that we talk about a lot at Earthworks, and that's also mentioned in the report, is the need to implement free, prior, and informed consent, which means that no projects move forward without the consent of the indigenous peoples that territory belongs to. And I think in general, this is contributing to a push to sort of uphold and respect indigenous peoples' sovereignty, right? Which has been trampled on in so many ways for so long, including by the mining industry. So that's something that we talk about a lot, is FPIC, right? Or free, prior, and informed consent. We also, yes, think a lot about labor rights and how can we make mining safe for workers. I think that's so important, and making sure that labor kind of has a seat at the table as we're talking about transition mineral mining is really important. I think also it's really important to point out that you just won't be able to achieve clean energy with mining. Like, mining is a very dirty industry. And so if we are proposing all of these solutions that require more mining, that's actually not leading us towards clean energy. Mining is honestly like kind of a bit of a waste management industry. It creates a huge amount of what's called tailings or mine waste, which is often toxic waste that has to be managed in perpetuity. And we've also seen some horrific, huge scale accidents or disasters from tailings dams and from tailings facilities or mine waste facilities. In 2019, there was a horrible disaster where the mine company Vale, their tailings facility failed, and 272 people, many of them workers for the mine, died as a result. And that was something that they had been warned about by structural engineers and didn't really act on it. And I think another thing to keep in mind is that the mining industry, like mineral extraction and processing, is responsible for about 17% of greenhouse gases globally. And so when we're talking about reducing our dependence on fossil fuels because we're concerned about some of the climate impacts, it's really important to also look at mining because it's also creating a lot of climate impacts. And I think we often look at these industries as if they're two very different things, but it's very important to recognize sort of the harmful legacies that mining has left on a lot of ecosystems and communities, and think about how to prevent those from happening in new places, or how to sort of rectify those situations. So yes, we kind of look at a few different resources that we point to that have guidelines of regulations that can be put into place to attempt to protect ecosystems and communities from the harmful impacts of mining.
Yeah, and you touched on this briefly, like once the mine has given all it's got to give, and I don't know enough about environmental mining and all this stuff to really maybe sound intelligent in this regard, but there has to be a way not only to manage all that stuff, that the runoff and make sure it doesn't get in the groundwater, but there has to be a way. You're just not going to leave a giant, or you shouldn't just leave a giant hole in the ground. There's got to be something that can be used for, that would be beneficial to a community. Like when you see mining operations and they've got this big giant hole in the middle of a community, what are the options there? Did they just leave it there? Like, I genuinely don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think unfortunately they do often sort of get left there, or there is, in theory, at the end of a mine operation, there should be a whole closure plan that is implemented in order to safely close a mine facility. And this closure plan is something that should be designed from the very beginning of the mine project. And often it doesn't exist. I think, one of the cases that we're currently working on is a mine in Panama, where the mine has had its contract revoked for a second time by the Panamanian government, due to a lot of concerns about its management and just concerns with the contract itself. And now communities are sort of worried because there is no safe closure plan that's been presented. And so they're left with that exact question of like, okay, now we have this mine that for a while they've been sort of trying to speak up about some of the concerns that they have about contamination that they're noticing in their water sources. And there isn't a clear plan of how that's going to be cleaned up and how it's going to be safely closed, right? So I think, in theory, you would have that. And unfortunately, it doesn't always happen. And I think another thing, too, is in particular, with the push for certain minerals for clean energy, for stuff like rare earth elements or REEs, you see some people talking about remining, which is where you go in and mine a closed mine site and you mine the tailings or the mine waste. Maybe it's because it is now economically feasible to extract metals or minerals that previously were not seen as economically feasible and were left there, or because technology has advanced and so you're able to work with something that has a much lower ore grade. But the issue with that is that often these facilities aren't safely closed, and so you can be assuming a lot of risks by entering into that type of operation. And also, they need to be regulated just like any other mine site, and often kind of slip through regulatory loopholes and aren't seen as a regular mining operation, and so don't fall under mining regulation or code or law. There was a really horrifying tailings disaster that happened at a remining site in South Africa a few years ago that kind of shows why that can be so dangerous. So while I agree that in theory, mining companies should be entering into operations with a safe closure plan at the end, that unfortunately is often not the case.
Okay, so I don't like to end my shows. I do often end them on a bummer. So I don't want to end it on a bummer here. Let's leave a nice positive feeling in everybody's hearts. What are you hopeful for? What do you like what you're seeing in the near future in this space?
I think I actually see this report as quite a hopeful report. Maybe I didn't do a great job of selling it that way. But, this report is looking at case studies from around the world, a lot of different regions that have their own contexts and governments and, different structures that kind of come into play that are implementing solutions to reduce mineral demand already. And for me, I see that as a big sign of hope that, these solutions are out there. the technology in many cases to implement solutions to reduce mineral demand is already out there. And really, it's just time for politicians to kind of get on board and fund those types of solutions and programs and infrastructure. So I see that as a big point of hope, I think. And I think the other thing that I see as a big point of hope is, we're not trying to say that we are against any kind of energy transition or against a transition away from fossil fuels. We're just saying we want to do this in a way so that it is equitable and just for as many people as possible. And I see that as a very, very hopeful thing. I think, reducing mineral demand is sort of one element of building towards a more just and inclusive and equitable energy transition, which for me is a point of hope.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. Paulina, thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing all of this information with us. Where can people go and find out more about Earthworks?
Yeah, of course. People can find out more about Earthworks on our website, which is earthworks.org. They can also follow us on social media. We have a Twitter, which I believe is also just just Earthworks on Twitter, as well as an Instagram. And that's a good way to kind of keep up to date about what is happening there.
All right. Thank you very much for coming on. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Man, that was a good interview. This is not the world that I live in. Like, I do consider myself to be environmentally conscious. I do care about this stuff, but I am in no way, shape, or form an expert in any of these things. Like, the only thing that really makes me qualified to talk about anything is the fact that I can afford a microphone and a computer to record this on. But it gives me a lot of hope for the future when there are people out there like Paulina and the group that put this together and the researchers who took the time to write this report that think about this kind of stuff. It's just, I don't know. Gives me a lot of hope for the future. So thank you very much, Paulina, for coming on and being so generous with your time. I would also like to thank William and Claire for taking the time to set this up. There's a lot to juggle for setting up these interviews, and William and Claire were just fantastic. So thank you very much. All right, everybody, that is it for me this episode. Friday's episode is going to be news, and then next Tuesday's episode, we're going to cover Rivian's earnings call. If you want to email me, you can. It's Bodie, BODIE at 918digital.com. And you can also find me on Twitter or X at 918digital. Hope you all have a wonderful week, and I will talk to you on Friday.